Welcome, everybody. My name is Claire Munoz, and I'm the Charles and Matheson Senior Director of Education here at the museum. We have a wonderful guest here today, Michael Moore, and he will be in conversation with Bill Fox, the Director of the Center for Art and Environment. I'm just acknowledging that we have two audiences here today. So we have our in-person audience, but we also are hosting a virtual audience. So we'll be kind of typing on the side and don't want to be a distraction, but do want to acknowledge that we have some people visiting from afar to watch today's conversation. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Bill to do a nice introduction.
Thanks, Claire. Yeah, that's great. Hi, everyone. It's I have to turn on. It's amazing to be in person. It's really nice to see people actually in front of us versus being virtual. But it's wonderful to welcome the virtual audience too. So the nice thing that we've experienced over the last 2 years is the greatly expanded reach of our program. So we have people around the world who are checking in and watching what we're doing here. That's always great. So I've known Mike for 30 years, and he's shown at the Shepherd Gallery at UNR, and he has shown in Fallon at the Oaks Park School, Churchill Arts Council, and he's had an exhibition at Strumwell Gallery, but he's never shown here before. So it's just a treat to have him here, and it's wonderful to have him next to the Latimer exhibition upstairs. Latimer was very important to the formation of the early history of our institution. And so to see this wonderful, strong landscape, mountainscape, desertscape tradition continue for more than 100 years is just, it's brilliant. Mike was born in Los Angeles in 1942. And in 1950 or thereabouts, he gets to La Cañada, which is a small part of a small town that's part of the greater LA area that's right against the San Gabriel Mountains. It's up by Pasadena. And that's really where the desert begins. And so as a young lad, you were on the edge of the desert, wandering around both in the San Gabriels and the LA Basin, but also in Eastern Sierra and in Death Valley and places like that. So Mike has long had a foot in our territory. In 1960, he goes to Stanford, and he gets his, I just want to double check here, he gets a BA in art, and then he goes to Yale for a year. He only stays for a year, but he's in the Yale School of Art, and he meets a guy named David Rumsey while he's there. And David is now one of the world's greatest map collectors, among other things. He's an extraordinary individual, and Stanford actually has a map center named for him, and it's populated with his collection. I'm sad. I really wanted at least some of that collection here, but you know, who doesn't love a map, right? So in any case, the two of them start a series of adventures, and Mike's going to show us images from the places that he started going to, most of which are north of here. It's territory that's north of I-80. It's up by Hawaii and places like that. So it's not places most of us have actually been to. But that series of adventures eventually lead Mike and David to the top of a mountain outside Winnemucca, where there's a derelict radar station. And they buy the station, and Mike moves in and starts painting. And that's really when I really became aware of your work, because Kirk told me, Kirk Robertson, who used to be at the Churchill Arts Council, is gone now, and Kirk was working for me at the State Arts Council. And Kirk walks into my office and says, "There's this guy you got to meet. He lives in a radar station outside of Winnemucca." I'm like, "What? He lives in a what?" He said, "Yeah, he's on top of a mountain. He lives in a radar station. Great painter. You got to meet this guy." So we did. And the shift that happens in Mike's life then, and he'll kind of walk you through, is he goes from taking pictures of what he's seeing in the desert and then taking pictures home to San Francisco and painting in a studio there. He goes from that kind of practice to actually painting where he is on the site. So it's a big shift, and it's an important one. And then he and David stumble across Wall Spring. Was Linda part of that too? You're there. Were you part of that too?
Oh, yes, I was.
Okay. Yeah. So this is
I was flown in for approval.
That's quite proper. She was flown in for approval. That's quite proper. So this is Linda Fleming, who's Michael's longtime partner in life and art. She's actually had 2 shows here at the museum. She is a noted sculptor, does phenomenal geometries in space that are exquisite. So, so the two of them, they find this place called Wall Spring. Three of them, David and Mike. Probably dogs involved too. I'm not sure. There were dogs involved, and a dog. And And Wall Springs is in the Smoke Creek Desert, which is just southwest of Black Rock Desert. So you go to Gurlock and you turn left and you go down the highway as if you're going up into California, and then you turn on a dirt road and you drive down that dirt road and you're in the Great Smoke Desert, or the Smoke Creek Desert. And they have lived in this beautiful oasis, and the property is extraordinary with multiple studio spaces and so forth. And again, he takes that practice of where he is where he paints. So I think I just want to say two more things maybe up front, and then I'm going to turn it over to Mike and let him kind of walk us through. This talk today is not really a talk so much about Mike's actual paintings as it is about the life that produces the paintings. So it's what he's looking at, what he's seeing, and how that turns into his life. It's really a conversation about prolonged looking and how important that is to us. The Center for Art and Environment, which is our research branch here at the museum, collects archives, and Mike's part of the archive, collects archives about creative human interactions with natural, built, and virtual environments. We think that's an existential activity. The reason we think that is because if you don't know where you are, you don't know how to treat where you are. You don't know how to act responsibly in the place that you are. So prolonged looking is part of the practice for an artist, and by extension, what we learn from this, but part of our practice too, as human beings. Prolonged looking means that you know your place. It means you know the place you are geographically, right? But also means you know your correct place in the universe. And so you learn how to act ethically about where you live. So I would argue that's the importance of your work. You can have words with me over that though. So yeah, turn your mic and get all the flip up. Lights on. Lights on.
Lights on now.
Great. Hello.
Okay, so
Hold it just a little bit closer. So.
okay. So growing up in Nautical, which seemed like every year one side of the valley would burn, and the next year the other side of the valley would burn. I got close to the desert and out into Death Valley, and up about as far as Bridgeport, place I didn't know about. And if you imagine a horizontal line, maybe 500 miles across, with a vertical line on the left side, which is the California-Nevada border, and a vertical line going up on the right side, which is the border.
Mike, we
Idaho
can't hear
border.
you on this slide. Can we just check that?
Keeps going.
Let's see. It says it's on.
Hello, check.
Just have to get closer.
Yeah,
Okay, much closer.
yeah, much closer. And then don't tap on the table because it'll pick it up on the mic.
Okay, so
I can close you with that.
yeah, imagine a horizontal line with Oregon above and Nevada below, and on the left side, a vertical line dropping from it with California, a little bit of California on the left and Nevada on the right, and on the right side, a vertical line going out with Idaho and Oregon. And that's kind of the area that I have been going to, but knew nothing about until a trip in 1967 where some random friends of mine took off for the desert, and we ended up going to Cedarville and heading east across what's called the Sheldon Range, which borders Oregon and the Nevada desert. And I was just blown away that there was such vast space to it. This first image is actually from the Dufferin Rim, which is out in the middle of that country. It's probably 5,000 to 6,000. And I later did a bunch of paintings from that, but at first I just wanted to see that space. It took me about 4 or 5 years before I got back, and then I began pushing north. Went to Pyramid Lake with a group of people when we did random art droppings and drove around in camouflage vehicles and things. So that was a little much, so I started going north with fewer and fewer people. And that's actually Black Rock Desert, but and I would.
Darker, can we have less light in?
Oh, maybe, can we turn that?
Yeah, can you turn down that ambient that's on the screen?
Oh, yeah, that's helpful.
Is that help?
That's a little better.
Yeah. I'll go back to deferring it just because I can. So the way it worked, the way I always worked, even when I was very young and walking out and then I would go to the desert on family trips with the local photographer, was I would come back and I would do drawings from my imagination and just kind of conjure up what I thought I'd seen or had seen. And this continued into once I really started painting for many years. I would work in a studio in San Francisco. I would drive around the desert, climb up little peaks, bring back those experiences and just try to evoke them in paintings. And as Bill mentioned, I met David Rumsey in New Haven, and he eventually moved to San Francisco, and I started taking him out on some of the trips. And his idea was, I want to own some of this. He was in real estate at the time. I want to own some of this. And my thing was, why do you need to own it? It's Nevada. We're not in California anymore. You can just pull off and camp, for God's sake. But he kept wanting to own stuff. And after about 10 years of that, we found this radar station, which, if I get this straight, we were going into the Hawaii, which is north and south of the Nevada line, but far eastern Oregon, far western southern Idaho. Oops, there. And onto the Black Rock. These are just old pictures from then. Oh, back. We didn't need four-wheel drive, we just need to go really slow. But in 1986, maybe 7, we were going on one of the usual trips, and Dave was always on the phone to realtors, and we found this realtor in Winnemucca operating out of a Tia Session gas station, and said, "Oh, this rancher wants to get rid of 40 acres on top of Ogden Peak, and that's a radar station." That sounds really interesting. And we were on our way for a week-long trip or something, and had a bunch of fuel and camping things and whatever. Turned off at Inlay and drove up this long drive into the fog. Not this far, it was earlier. And got to a saddle and looked a couple of thousand feet down into Grass Valley as it were. And I was like, whoa, this is pretty cool. And the road zigzagged into the clouds from there, and zigzagged up into the clouds. And here was this concrete block building, completely blocked up, but it had power and phone. It had phone and power. So it had been a radar station. And he needed, so we got to buy this. We got to go back. I said, well, let's at least climb the peak and look around and see what's going on. And climbed it, saw what's going on, and rushed to town and immediately bought 40 acres surrounded by, fortunately, 960 acres of mineral rights, because people were always scratching around up there with bulldozers. And when I started working up there and spending several months of the year, and it was a little tin shack. And as Bill mentioned, that's when the work, I kept going back to the city and evoking experiences, but I started painting what was more or less out the windows. I've never been a plein air painter. I've been an out the window painter or kitchen table painter. And in that period, the mid to late 80s, Dave was really on a tear, and there was a large part of what we've been doing in the Hawaii, and I've been doing in the Hawaii, was trying to find ways to cross the river, cross the main canyon. I recently met a guy who spent his whole life, he grew up outside of it, he spent his whole life in the canyons, walking them and kayaking.
Ignore me.
Yeah. Man. Okay. But on one or two of my solo trips, I almost gotten across the canyon at this place called Drum Basin, which was part of a historic ranching property. And I kept telling Dave about it, and he, of course, in his research, found that there was 80 acres privately owned and a willing seller, as they said. In fact, kind of enthusiastic seller, really interesting old rancher up there named Jim Anderson. Unfortunately, drowned trying to cross the river a few years later on a horse. You could get a vehicle down in the canyon on the Nevada side or towards Nevada side, but you couldn't get it up on the Oregon side, although you could get horses and cattle and stuff. So, you know, he sight unseen started talking to Anderson, and more or less came to an understanding, but he hadn't seen it, so we flew out to Boise and went out there in a helicopter and walked around in the dead of winter, and he said, okay, we'll do it. And a year later, having acquired this, we had a 28-foot trailer drive out there, and then we had this base way out in the Hawaii that we'd never had, so we could go out and spend a week at a time in inclement weather and just explore down in the canyons and up on the tables and stuff. And Linda became a part of that too, and dogs. But meanwhile, a few years later, I needed a better studio and built this thing on the ridge, salvaging a piece of the property at Radar, which was one of the mining scars where a person that had been an old miner in his retirement had been up there with a cat and had just bulldozed kind of a large trench across the ridge, and that seemed like a good place to build a studio. So that was a place that I did a lot of oil paintings, and a couple of years into it, we had a fellowship to go to Friends, and I didn't have much of a studio there. I continued a little bit of oil painting, but I took up watercolors again, which I had done for many years before, and returned to Radar and set up in a corner and painted the views looking out to the west, and everything was downhill, so it was a really different aspect from the work I'd done before. And since that time, I just continued obsessed with watercolors. Whenever I'm in the country, I do watercolors. Probably hundreds of diptychs that were done in the studio, and many hundreds of triptychs and individual pieces like the ones upstairs that I did when we got to Wall Spring. So Radar went on. This is the view out the watercolor corner reflected in the window, looking through to the view that drops maybe 4,000 feet down to Grass Valley, looking southward east to the Tobin Range. I actually worked in that studio from maybe 91 to 96, and then we got involved with Wall Spring, which was a place that next door to the Parker Ranch on the Salt Creek. And Dave had always been in love with the Parker Ranch, but I eschewed it somewhat. I thought it was too close to California. It's only like 30 miles from the California line or something, although it takes about an hour and a half. But he had pursued the owner for maybe 13 years. And an owner, John Casey, won't say anything to anybody around here besides Bill, but he apparently never sold any eggland in a very long career. And they managed to persuade him after 18 years. And, oh God, I see that there. During that time, though, we were very busy, and we took the old studio and moved it up the hill so that Linda could use it. And that's the view to the west from Radar area generally, which looked like this. But we set out 90 miles to the west, mainly on dirt roads, through this is a road that runs directly from Winnemucca over to Gerlach. It's called the Jungle Road or the High Road. Or I think it actually has a county road number now, but this is Jungle Flats, which are about a quarter of the way over, and Scotia, which is out there on the way. This is all kind of territory that I digest and kind of, continue to evoke in the studio. My paintings that are upstairs here for the next couple of months are all those evocations. But October of 94, I think, Dave had got John Casey to agree to sell Parker Ranch and Wall Spring, something like, and 80 acres with some springs up the hill, and a bunch of first refusal on any piece of private ground that actually could be seen from there. For what Casey wouldn't sell 10 years before, wouldn't sell the 40 acres around the ranch. So that was interesting. Yeah. This was the Parker Ranch place, which is the developed place that we got when we first saw it. And that became a huge project. This is Wall Spring, when a year or so into it, which was just a tabula rasa. There were two trees on the 160 acres when we arrived. One was a juniper near the playa, and a big cottonwood right out at the side of the old spring. The old spring had become a sinkhole, but the advantage of this place was there were artesian wells or artesian flows. So I set up on the north side with some trailers in the plywood building. I built this miniature studio and kind of just replaced that roof once it, because living in a trailer can get a little trying at times. And then maybe 6 years later, we began to add a house to that. That shows kind of what the country's like. We'd already built a studio building, a metal building, so I was able to work in the building. Linda was able to work in the building. We were able to kind of stage stuff. It was very different from working at radar, where everything was downhill. And also I was working in oil painting. Once we moved over here, I went back to only acrylic and trying watercolors, but I never really hit a stride with them. I didn't hit a stride with watercolors. Ended up with a kitchen. But we did start a sculpture park. And that's a sculpture of Linda's on the upper pond, the second pond we have. We have a lot of water, relatively a lot of water. Which a few years later began to look like this. And by that time I had a proper studio that I would work in, the regular times of the day, looking out the window, but not literally painting as much as I did. But by then I also developed this watercolor practice where I spend a couple hours every morning doing a triptych, looking at the same view at the same time of the day, usually kind of mid-morning, and it would just capture the light of that day. And so we've been there now over 20 years, over 25 years, I guess. And these trees were all pole planted near the water. It became really a gardening project, as much as anything. Trying to create a habitat with a habitat. And it's been rewardingly successful, not as successful as next door at Parker, where it's being a little lower, it has a lot more artesian flow and a lot more wetlands and stuff, but we get birds nesting and fish and stuff. We kept going back, less and less as time has gone on, and I mean, I'm in the country, but just getting off the land feels like getting into the country. It feels very domestic now. Time has gone on. I don't really work ethic. This is looking back at it in, is that the spring before?
Launch the table there.
Oh, sorry. And this is fairly recent. So that's how there was nothing there when we started. And this is the view off the porch with, one of the most significant events of my time in the Hawaii when I found that dog in a coyote trap who stayed with us for 14 years. Was seemingly an enlightened being, a Buddhist friend in Colorado who says often bad llamas are reincarnated as dogs, and Lefty must have been a really bad llama to be abandoned in the Hawaii 4 miles from any paved road. And you must have been as bad acolyte to find him. But we had, he was an amazing creature. And I've never saved any other lives in my life, as far as I know. So there was that. So we just continued with 3 studios. I had 2 when I met Linda, and she had one in Colorado that she wasn't going to give up, having built it as a child, more or less. So we're migratory artists now between the Bay Area here and Southern Colorado. And we have studios in every place. The work varies from place to place. I still paint Nevada and Colorado, but it's all the same application of memories. So. And I still do that pretty much in Venetian. And then our wall swing, I had a big wall of south-facing windows, which used to look down the desert, but now the desert has been obscured by these damn trees, so I have to make it up there too. Any more questions?
That's great, Mike. Yeah, well, one of the things, how many of you have actually been upstairs and seen the grid of the watercolors on the wall? Yeah, no, good. So those of you who haven't, you really should go up and take a look at those, obviously. Sometimes I think, oh, what a great flip book, right? You take all of these little paintings, they're like this big, right? And you can just line them up and you can go through and you can see the landscape, with the light changing over the year and so forth. Doesn't quite work that way. Mike's painting out the window at the same thing every day, except the world isn't the same every day. If for no other reason, we're not the same every day. So if you do imagine looking through those paintings and comparing them one to another very quickly, what you get is a flickering landscape. You get a landscape where the mountain profiles change just a little bit. The light is radically different from some weeks to other weeks. And you really get a notion of a world that's in motion. So he's staying in the same spot. He's at the same table. He's rooted. I walk in for lunch and here's all this stuff spread out on the kitchen table, right? And yet the world around him is changing. And that's in part his mind and in part the condition of the world itself. So it's a unique practice. You can draw some comparisons with other painters. I think of you coming back, in the summertime or springtime out to the spring, and I think of Latimer coming out to Fallen Leaf Lake every summer to work with the clubs. Yeah, so it's a wonderful practice, Mike.
Yeah, thank you. It also, that's a whole year, and it's part of the year because those are the little watercolors I started doing in concert with triptychs. So I do 4 paintings a day at the table year round. So it's a way of seeing, clocking climate change too. Some of the early works would snow, way into March. There was some of them are dry the whole time. But I want to go back, since we're talking about upstairs, just for a minute to make a couple of comments about paintings that are up there. When you go into the room, the chapel-like setting at the end, that wonderful skylight has a square painting that is one of the ultimate expressions of the early work where I would come back and recreate things. It's called Enigma of the Sheldon Ridge, it's a big square painting. And didn't realize how close I was getting at the time, but for many years, a friend of mine owned that painting, and he also he's born in the southern desert, but I introduced him into this northern territory, and he was up visiting us once and drove through the shelter, and he said, very good amateur photographer. And he took pictures of it, and he took a picture that looks almost exactly like that Enigma of the Shelter. But I had worked through that, and that sort of way of watercolorist recollection. And in the late 70s, I was flailing around to do something else. And I started thinking, well, maybe I could use my photographs for something. Started out by doing some paintings from pictures I'd taken above Paradise, looking down from any summit. It's almost like this weird presaging of what happened with radar 10 years later when I had the aerial views, right out the window. And then, that seemed promising. So I started going out and taking pictures that I could use for paintings. And one of the big series was from Dufarena. This is from the grade looking out across Thousand Creek, this valley, but there's a real escarpment behind me and to the right of this picture, and I started dancing around on the escarpment, looking back at the old wagon roads, and there's a paved road that runs through there, and then several historic wagon roads, so there's a lot of traces from the desert. And so the second painting, in terms of age in the show up there, is the Dufarena diptych, which is actually an inadvertent diptych, and they were the first two paintings I did from these photographs. And the first one is the one on the right, and the second one was the one on the left. So the studio, which at the time I was working out of a basement in a building that David Rumsey had bought in Upper Hay, which was, still sketchy at that time. So I had like about 6-foot walls between the foundation and the ceiling of this garage, basement garage. And so I painted 5-foot paintings, and they were all in a row, and I think I did about 8. That was what I could do. And then at a certain point, I realized, moving them around, that if I put the first one to the left, or the first one to the right of the second one, it almost entirely lined up. So I had this inadvertent diptych. And those paintings evolved into these crazy abstractions, and then it became very opaque paintings that had very opaque paint as opposed to more watercolor stuff. So there was a whole weird evolution that occurred into the 80s. And I think we skip a decade in the show there, and then there's Enrico's painting, and they go around like that. Yeah.
We have any questions?
This is a long way from nowhere. How did you get your materials, and did you actually do any of the constructing yourself with your own hands? Did you get a builder out there?
Repeat the question.
No. Oh, do I need to repeat those? Oh, yeah. Okay. How did we get materials out there? Art and construction. Did we do our own construction? I had done like renovation work and stuff, and then when I worked in San Francisco, and that was a way of keeping things together. I had a brilliant career for about 4 years where I was selling enough work in galleries that I didn't have to think about it. I went back into house painting and that. So I had like kind of hammer and nailing skills, rudimentary. So when we got radar, I did a lot of we hired a contractor to put windows in and bring in a stove and stuff. And then I did the drywall and things like that. And a year or so later, I met Linda, who I think of as my little homemaker, because she had already built several houses. She helped build a dome, and she built a studio. And that gave me the confidence and with a little help, to actually build something. So the first thing I built up there was a storage shed So I was attaching it to a building, baby steps, but I actually built 3 walls and a roof. And then about 4 years out, I did build that studio myself. And we were 40 minutes from Winnemucca with a road that was usable 6 to 8 months of the year. So you could drive stuff up there. It had power and electricity, or it had phone and electricity, line power, and no water. So it had the 2 things that Wallspring didn't have. And in the wintertime, sometimes I'd have to snowshoe and backpack whatever materials I was working with. But most of the year I could bring a pickup truck up. And one thing that happened at Radar was it changed the size I was working on. I had a car and had a back seat, and I was doing oil paintings, which should dry, and I'm very impatient, so I'd have the oil paintings that I'd want to take back to San Francisco and look at and see. I built a box that would exactly fit in the back seat of a 70 Dodge Challenger, and it would hold 14-inch by 48-inch paintings, or 3 14 by 14, had little shelves in it. So I would slide the paintings into the box and bring them off the mountain, and then be able to take them back and consider them and do more. Well, we got to Wallspring has year-round access, lots of water, no phone, no electricity. The phone had to be radio phone, and the electricity was solar. So. And Dave had a contractor build him a nice 2-story house, and we did most of our building out there ourselves. But the last thing we did in 2014, was to build a repository for work, which is a big industrial building, and we actually paid somebody to do that. They did a really nice job. It's 32 by 64 feet, I think. But I think when we were starting at Wallspring, it was 1996, and there were lumberyards here that would deliver, and you needed an inspection, Bruce, or you needed a permit. I mean, you get a permit in like a few weeks, and you needed an inspection. You could leave a message and they'd be out the next day, 2 hours out of town. I mean, I found that really remarkable, having spent all my working life in doing that stuff in the Bay Area. So, you don't know what a bottle of tequila is, it'll get them. The wear phenomenon takes a bottle of tequila to get the inspector, but maybe not anymore.
Yeah, you mentioned the Dodge Challenger kind of trekking up to the radar station, which is not what I would think most people would think it'd be a suitable vehicle for such a remote, rough road, right? And I was curious about, I know you have an interest in vehicles, and I was wondering if you've reflected on the influence or the role of vehicles in how you understand or interpret the landscapes that you're so invested in.
Now, there's a question, which I'll sum up as the influence of vehicles in my practice, and also the efficacy of a Dodge Challenger getting to a radar station. Read my book, which is available in the bookstore, called Autobiographies. But the Challenger never went all the way to the radar station. It made it up to Dunblin Pass, and we parked it on the road. The reason that was my second car. I only had single trucks before that, which I would lightly modify for access to the backcountry. Things that would go slow and have a little ground clearance. The Challenger was inspired by watching Vanishing Point, which somebody turned me on to. And I discovered there was a highway patrolman over in out of, oh, I'm forgetting the name, but on 80, halfway up 80. It was a great vanishing point also, but it was during the 55-mile-an-hour speed limit, so I would see him off of it. But I used a storage space in one of my leave my truck there and drive up in the Dodge and then take the truck up and box the paintings and bring them back. Like that.
The Challenger was the car that won my heart.
Oh, it was. And what else can I say about it? I mean, I've always had like some vehicle.
Right, no, I was curious though, knowing you have a passion for vehicles, is there some interface between that and landscape for you?
An interface between vehicles and the landscape, yes, I think. If only that I would like, early on, I wanted to make it look right in the landscape when I was out there, so I camouflaged almost everything I had. And would kind of outfit things so that they'd be more efficacious in what was essentially car camping and long driving trips. For a while it was, how many miles can I put in on a dirt road in a day? And then how few miles can I put in? Maybe I'll just walk around and stuff. And then there was the 64 Willys that I had for 2 years that took all my money and tried to kill me, which I went to the Hawaii, in which Dave and I went on a trip to the Hawaii in '78, and this wasn't the only time it tried to kill me, but the rear wheel bearing locked up, and it was one of the 2 times I had to walk out. We had to walk out overnight towards Hawaii, but first we ran into people who were servicing a pumping station, and drove us to the mountain home. I spent 2 nights going downtown. And I'm not a mechanic, so I can't really remember how I managed to do all this stuff.
But to your point, I don't remember seeing any people, even in a drawing. There must be, but I don't remember. But I remember the vehicles in the drawings, and I remember, and sometimes the vehicles are becoming part of the landscape, but kind of subsiding into the dirt, and then buildings and studios. But that's kind of the personality that's in the landscape.
Yeah, there are hardly any people in any of my photographs either. Although I was going to lead this slideshow with a picture of Dave looking out across the desert in 1973 next to what was the 60 Chevy I had then.
How many vehicles have you owned?
Not that many compared to people who are really into cars, I found. I mean, it's like kind of the hubris. Oh, I had a lot of cars, but now that I know people who build cars and sell them, so people build and sell cars more in a year than I've ever had, maybe 30, 35, I'm not sure. And I haven't had to think that. Well, I just got a new truck that looks just like the old trucks. But I tend to keep things a long time. Like I had a 67 Chevy for 10 years, and then I got a 68 Chevy that had 4-wheel drive that I kept for 10 years. That I had till 1995 or 6. And I got a Toyota Tundra that I had 19 years and just traded for another Toyota Tundra. So.
Yeah, I remember the first truck. Yeah, the first Toyota. I remember that one. So,
Yeah.
We have a little more time. One more question, maybe. Yeah.
In this photograph we're looking at, is the foreground, is that alkali? Or is it just the color or the dirt, sand?
What is the whiteness in the Dufresne picture that we have up? And I think that's just, I'm on the edge of a cut in the cliff, so it's like just a landfill or something. So it's very dry dirt, but it's not alkali. But further out, because alkaline. That's a very, I don't know, it's looking about 50 miles over the pine forest range. So that's just disturbed earth. Yeah,
So I think of the,
I'll go to another.
of all the characteristics of Mike's landscape paintings, I think the one that stands out for me, maybe there are two. One is that big space. And so, yeah, when we ask that question, is that alkali? Because he's so often painting playas, and that's so often part of his palette, right? So yeah, these enormous spaces, and then there's a kind of transparency that we've talked about here. So Ann Wolf, our chief curator, and David Walker, our director, were looking at some slides of Mike's work, and they're comparing him to Maynard Dixon and thinking about kind of that art history and that art that produces a painter like Mike. And we were all just thinking about, it's interesting, these landforms, they're so permeated with light. It looks like the light shining through the mountains in a sense. And I think it's very apparent upstairs in a couple of things. You look at that and you think like, well, they're solid. I know that's a mountain, but why am I looking through it? Why am I looking into it? So those are the two things I think that characterize your paintings.
Yeah, actually, when you were talking, I thought of one thing that I thought of upstairs. One of my original impetuses for making these paintings or reference ones was early Western landscape before Dixon even. I love Dixon, but got his hard edge to see them, which I really like. Like Carl Bowden's. Oh, good, that's whatever it is. It's not doing it up there. I was looking at the backgrounds of his landscapes, and there'd be like boats and rivers or Native Americans or a fort in the foreground. I would look at the background of it, that long narrow strip at the end of the plains. Something I thought, I want to paint that. That's what I'm going to try to do. And I think the really early one where you're talking about playas. You also at one point mentioned Nautical Maps. Was that you or was that David? These early maps where they would do a long narrow strip of the coast for navigation.
Coastal profiles, yeah.
Yeah. And I realized retroactively that as I was really starting off, like a couple of years into painting, just 4 or 5 years into paintings, I did these layered landscapes, and they would all be like those references. But it came from a year I spent north of LA on the beach and in the water a lot. Not greatly surfing, but sloshing around on a surfboard, looking back at the Malibu Mountains, or looking and always having that. And then coming from radar to live on the edge of the playa and walking out to the edge of the playa every day. So that horizontality, which I think was always like a primary part of how I saw things, and distance too, and a little elevated distance, just took off.
Yeah, that's great. You and I did talk about coastal profiles. I'm looking
Yeah,
at
I thought you were the first person to mention it. And then I saw some you illustrated before. You sent all those maps to Stanford. You didn't get any, but you can get them online for free.
It is the greatest online cartographic resource outside of Swiss Togo and
Swiss.
Bern. Yeah, but it's the greatest resource you can imagine. You have to look at this map collection and zoom in on those individual maps. Claire, I think we're very close to being out of time. So I would like to thank all of you for coming this afternoon. And I would like to thank our visitors online who are with us and have been able to hear Mike speak this afternoon. So thank you very much. We look forward to seeing you again at another Earth Day.